Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for making time to be here with us for this ST Lee Distinguished Annual Lecture. The MC has stolen my thunder and told you all about the lecture, but it's one of our highlights at RSIS, and we organize it in memory of Dr. Lee Seng Tee, who many of you will know was a distinguished businessman, philanthropist, and benefactor of many educational institutions, including the Nanyang Technological University. And that enables us to bring people like Professor Peter Frankopan for this lecture every year. And the topic that he has chosen is inherently interesting. It's multipolar Asia and the reconfiguration of global power. We've been working him very hard at several sessions over the past 2 weeks, and he's been doing several of these sessions, closed door, meeting people, and today we get a chance for all of you to engage with him. But let me just say a few words of introduction about Professor Peter Frankopan. He is the Professor of Global History at Oxford at Worcester College. I'm very happy today to be able to welcome one of my fellow graduates from my old alma mater, so welcome to Singapore and RSIS. He's also the UNESCO Professor of Silk Road Studies at King's College, Cambridge, and President of various scholarly societies like the Royal Historical Society and the Royal Society of Asian Affairs. He has been described as a rock star academic by none other than our dean last week at an internal discussion, which made me go and Google that reference. And he's been likened to folks like Niall Ferguson and Francis Fukuyama, and so very, very high expectations for no pressure for the talk today. But I think it's partly to do with the best-selling books that he has written in recent times. In 2015, The Silk Roads, A New History of the World, which looks at history through the lens of the trade flows between East and West, rather than the more, shall we say, Eurocentric view of the world. And that was named the Sunday Times Book of the Decade, 2010-2019. Book of the Decade, not just Book of the Year.
I'm going for millennium.
But he did a sequel to that. Part 2 was The New Silk Roads, the present and the future of the world. But my favorite, and I think the most fascinating book, is the most recent one, 2023, called The Earth Transformed, An Untold History, which looks at climate and nature and the environment as the stage on which history plays out, and therefore shapes what happens in the world. And I think that's certainly something we'll want to talk about as we go into the discussion. That book was named the Book of the Year by the Financial Times and the Guardian, and the Times of London called it the History Book of the Year. Apart from all his scholarly work, he somehow finds time to play cricket, played at the national level. He's a football fan. Chelsea Football Club, I think, will be mentioned somehow in the talk, and certainly was in his previous ones. And he's also the co-owner of a group of hotels called a Curious Group of Hotels, which certainly piqued my curiosity. Are they sort of historically themed, or does it involve time travel of some sort?
We'll do that with Q&A. We'll do the Q&A.
Okay, maybe. Well, but today his topic is really multipolar Asia and the reconfiguration of global power. So how past examples of multipolarity shapes the evolving global order. And I think you'll all be familiar with the quote from Winston Churchill, who said, "The further backwards you can look, the further forwards you can see." And I think that is really Professor Frankopan's speciality. And I noticed in one of his books, the most recent one, he said, "As a historian, I know that the best way to address complex problems is to look back in time, as this helps provide context, perspective for the current and future challenges." And that sentence really resonated with me, because the National Security Studies program, which I run at RSAS, has this idea of looking at the past to try and understand the events of today and see how that might impact the future. So that certainly intrigued me, and I'm looking forward to your talk and lecture. He will speak for about half an hour or so, and then we'll go into Q&A so we can have a bit of a discussion with all of you here as well. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Professor Frankopan. Thank you.
So we all think at the moment we're living in an age of profound dislocation and crisis. Possibly that's even right. I've given a few talks here in the last couple of weeks around some of the changing ideas of the changing environment and climate, demographics and fertility. I'll say something about all of these, about new technologies that are going to change and are changing the way that we live. And I'm going to mainly focus today on geopolitics. But the idea that we're living in an age of polycrisis is something that has caught the mind and attention of lots of commentators. So I wrote something earlier this year in the Cambridge Journal of Regents, Economy and Society to remind that I don't mind labels like polycrisis, that's fine. But I'm not quite sure it's really a crisis. Today here in Singapore in October 2025, there are lots of things I'm reasonably worried about, but none of them make me really worried. Like this did. In the 530s and 540s, in the middle of the 6th century, there was a machine gun set of 3, probably, volcanic eruptions that had a massive dramatic impact on global climate change that led to failed harvests, that led to spreads of disease, famine, dislocations, breakdown of trade networks, and brought about proper suffering. So we should be grateful for what we wish for. If the most worrying thing is Donald Trump in the White House, or Xi Jinping in Beijing, or Putin in Moscow threatening things that are worse than they're doing, maybe we should scale back our fears and think about more creative things. Or we can think about the 1340s, the time of the spread of the Black Death. I mean, I got asked about this last year by a magazine or a newspaper in the UK that said, is 2024 the worst year in history? So I suggested maybe the 1340s, when a third of Europe's population died from disease, probably about the same in the Middle East. We've now found markers through these amazing new technologies we have as historians to look at not just the phylogenetic tree of the plague virus, the pathogen, but also being able to work with skeletons to see that probably we're seeing markers of devastation in West Africa and in China too, and in India, where we never thought we detected plague, that probably this was worse than worrying about AI. Or, here closer to home, the 1940s, a generation at the time when both my parents had already been born by the start of the Second World War, where we saw change and dislocation on an epic scale. So I'm not here to tell you the world is going to be a safe and happy place, but maybe these kinds of shifts in power are startling because we don't use the perspective of history to think back at how we evaluate things properly. As a historian, I'm here to sell you bad news, but I'm also here to sell you good news, which is that crises usually produce good outcomes. So when Singapore left Malaysia in 1965, amongst the things that it produced was the SAF, which young men in this country still do their military service. And as I've been learning, had reinforced to me in the last couple of weeks how important that is for social cohesion in Singapore, for identities, for tolerances, for all the different ways in which societies blend together. That was a positive outcome that has had part of the reason why Singapore has had the success that it's had in the last 65 years or so. And of course, the EDB2 formed also in 1965. So crises can produce moments of clarity of thinking. And, without going too far into this, you can think, again, for example, the First World War, for the many millions who died, the most important beneficiary of war in Europe that brought in almost every corner of the world were 50% of the world's population who don't normally get written about, and that's women. Women's rights accelerated dramatically as a direct result of the impact of war and the fact that it turned out that women were perfectly capable to work in factories and perfectly able to exercise sensible votes at polling stations. So things can change and can improve through the process of crisis. And even with the Black Death that killed a third of the population, 40% of the population in Europe, as my colleague James Bellich at Oxford has written, amongst the upsides were that if you've got fewer people, meat is a lot cheaper because there are fewer mouths to feed, which means that costs come down. As it happens, we know that young brains are highly receptive to the fatty acids and the benefits of eating protein, so the population got healthier and possibly even cleverer. Things like horses and wagons, we see prices collapse. We see gaps of social incomes diverge quickly because suddenly, with fewer people, the cost of labour goes up, and people who had been wealthier were able to exploit workforces, this is a Karl Marx interpretation too, found those gaps quite beneficial. And in fact, because young people had survived they did what young people always do to celebrate, which is they drank a lot and they had a great deal of sex. So there's what's called by Professor Belich a marriage bonanza, as people thought there's no point saving money, we should spend it. We should live for today rather than tomorrow. So music, literature, fashion, all these things can flourish as a result of an age of crisis. So crisis is bad if you're one of the 40% who doesn't make it, but if you can survive, then there are upsides too. So I said I'd come and talk about multipolar Asia, and because I'm a good guest, I spend a lot of time reading and thinking about some of the things that distinguished scholars and thinkers here in Singapore have been saying. And Kishore Mahbani, who I've had the pleasure to do a couple of events with in the past, has been talking about the Asian century for a while now, and talking about how the demographics in Asia, the shifts of geopolitics, the rising levels of wealth mean that we're reaching a cleaving point where Asia and the West diverge. And as he wrote in this article in Foreign Affairs and in many books, in all analyses of its global challenges, the West assumes that it is the source of the solutions to the world's key problems. These are not my words, so if you would like to ask me about them, I can give you an opinion later, but I'm not going to talk about them now. In fact, however, the West is a major source of these problems. The West is understandably, it's in the middle paragraph for those who can't read it, understandably reluctant to accept that the era of its domination is ending and the Asian century has come. So thinking about what Asia means, in terms of its landmass, in terms of its constituent members, in terms of what an Asian century might look like, typically gets put into charts like this from the Financial Times about shares of global GDP, which look compelling, but it's very hard to understand what those actually mean in practice. So I've been reading also Bilahari Kausikan. This is a book that came out about 10 days ago, The Myth of the Asian Century, and this is another very distinguished Singaporean diplomat who takes a very different view to his colleague. Here, Mr. Kausikan says, the claim that the 21st century will be Asian, just as the 20th century was American, is often made but seldom examined. And in fact, as the top line here, it's time to peel away the layers of a cliche that's not just useless, but harmful. So where do you start? So I'm going to try to give an overview of Asia, some of the multipoles that have been emerging, and then I'll try to put that into a context that is thematic and then specific to Singapore. I don't remember what time I started because I didn't take my watch off. I'm about 10 minutes. Am I about 10 minutes in? Yeah. Okay. Good. Right. How am I doing? So far, so good.
Yeah, so cool.
Right. This is Asia, and it's very hard to argue with the idea that Asia is essentially meaningless. And I say that not just as a historian, but as someone who's spent a lot of time studying geology. My father studied geology as an undergraduate and told me that you had to always think about how stone structures and tectonic plates work. Asia is a label that is more or less meaningless, in the same way that Europe is a meaningless label. And I could stand here all afternoon and tell you that there's really not much in common between North Korea and Iran. There's not much in common between Istanbul and Singapore. There's not much in common between southern India and Okinawa. And yet there's lots of things that we have in common. We tend to have 2 arms and 2 legs. We tend to like to eat. We tend to like music. We tend to do lots of different things. So it depends where you want to draw that line to say we are all similar or not similar. But one of the things that I'm interested in as a historian is where ideas about Asia from Asian perspectives come about. And one of those most important ones is with the concept that's usually called the Silk Roads. Now, because ideas about the Silk Roads are often written by monolingual scholars who tend to be reacting to what they see, and a bit as Kishore Mahbani says, they think all ideas come from the West. Although it's true that German geographers start to use the word Silk Roads in the early 1800s, the real emphasis for scholarship behind what the Silk Roads mean comes from Japan, from Japanese scholars, particularly from about 1900 onwards. So in 1904, 1905, there's a war between Russia and Japan, and that is the first moment where an Asian power is able to decisively defeat Europeans. And that moment, as Tim Winter, who's based here in Singapore, has written about so eloquently and elegantly, kicks off a whole process of Japanese scholars trying to think about what does the world look like without Europeans? What does Asian civilization look like in its own terms, rather than having to constantly be told about Plato, Aristotle and Pythagoras and Euclid? Who are the great Asian scholars, great thinkers? Where are the great Asian religions? And not surprisingly, Japanese attention in particular falls on Buddhism and the spread of Buddhism from northern India that spreads into Central Asia and then up into China, eventually into the Bay of Bengal and into Southeast Asia too. But to think about how Islam, how Hinduism, how Asian religions have come into being provides a synthesis of how peoples across Asia could think about their pasts and their presents without having to incorporate Europeans and Westerners into that thinking. Not surprisingly, those ideas about Silk Roads fall on very fertile ground right at the western end of the Asian landmass, in the Ottoman Empire, where again the idea about Turkism and Turkish people and cultures, both across the steppe worlds of Central Asia, but into the Middle East too. It falls on fertile ground in India, at that time a British colony, where ideas about racial equalities and about harmony and about the future were highly engaged with people like Tagore, thinking about what did it mean to be Asian. So Pan-Asianism is something that is not new in the 21st century. The idea of an Asia that has connectivities, that has links, that has common histories, that has shared bonds is something that has had a long pedigree. And of course, all of those things fall into how people have moved and traveled around. So I spent yesterday afternoon in the Museum of Asian Civilizations here with my wife, which is a fantastic museum. And you see the kinds of things that the curators have been highlighting, the Tang Dynasty shipwreck, the ways in which great empires have interlocked with each other, and emphasizing that when people move, their reasons for doing so are complicated. And sometimes historians make the mistake of suggesting that motivations are simple. But my own motivations for being here today are extremely complicated. They're multifaceted, and I want to come and spend time in Singapore. I'm spending time with interesting people. It's nice not to be at my university in the first 2 weeks of the academic year. Lots of different reasons. But when people move, they bring ideas with them. Those ideas, sometimes they're about science and scholarship, but they're also about football teams. I love the fact that Singaporeans have learnt which is my football team by me saying that to one or two people. I don't know how Warren has found out that I'm a Chelsea fan, but I have to retrace my conversations. But you bring ideas with you. You find ways to collaborate and work together, whether you have different faiths, whether you have different languages, ethnicities, and so on, which of course is one of the reasons why Xi Jinping's idea about regalvanizing the Silk Roads has had a particular moment of sunshine, because what the story has tried to be anyway, however it's been phrased from a Chinese perspective, has tried to say we're not here for colonial purposes, we are here to find ways where we can trade together and be respectful of each other's cultures. You can save your questions about how that works, where it's worked and what its downsides are, however you want. But those ideas of connectivities and of links and of groupings and of places looking beyond their own place to look at wider connectivities is one of the reasons, of course, why we have things like ASEAN, and then in a couple of days' time up in KL, the latest meeting where you're going to be admitting a new member to the organisation in Timor-Leste, but to think about what does our neighbourhood look like and how wide does that go? Could Turkey, for example, become a member of ASEAN? Could Iran one day become a member of ASEAN? Could Peru become a member of ASEAN? After all, the connections from South America through Manila into this region from 1500 onwards, particularly 1571 when Manila is founded, one of the great global trade corridors of all time. So those concepts about what your neighbourhood looks like and how woolly that could be is something that you think about, I know, a lot here in Singapore, but so do lots of people. So Belt and Road, for example, thinking about China and its links around the world. India has a whole set of different things that look and sound a bit like the Silk Roads or China's Belt and Road Initiative in all but name. We have the Mausam Initiative, we have the so-called Cotton Route, we have, the Cotton Route, we have a whole set of different, the Go West Initiative, that basically is saying we want to invest in infrastructure that can allow goods and ideas and people to be able to move as effectively and as efficiently and as cheaply as possible. Because all governments recognize that the more trade you can galvanize, the greater your levels of tax receipts will be, and the greater levels of prosperity. So lots of people think in terms of connections in different directions. In India, in fact, you have also the IMEC, the India-Middle East Economic Corridor, that will thread, if it works, India with Iran, a sanctioned state, into UAE, through into Haifa in Israel, which has its own challenges too, and then into Europe. However these programs work or don't work, what I think is most interesting today is about how people are trying to conceptualize expansiveness and how the world we live in is not a local one, it's a regional one and a global one. I'll say a couple of things about that too. Lots of others are involved in this game. There we go, game over. So it's a slide of the Russian-Iran trade corridor, okay, as luck would have it, through to India. This is a slide showing the growth of the trade between Russia and Iran through going up 48% last year. And you'll have noticed, I'm sure if you were in this room, that we've had announcements from the MFA in Russia and in India saying that trade between Russia and India is going to double by 2030, which is not bad because it's gone up 5 times since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. But corridors, networks, connections are hugely significant. In fact, in the foreign concept note of the Russian Federation that was refreshed in 2023, Russia specifically is defining itself now as a Eurasian state, and one which has traditional links to Asia that no other European country has. And that we can definitely talk about if you'd like to, why they try to say that. Lots of different explanations. There's IMEC, again, if you see this from a perspective of Saudi, UAE, Jordan, Israel, it looks different from Europe and from India. You have the middle corridor going across my beloved Central Asian states, not just linking China and the West. These networks are connecting points within the group together. Sometimes we tend to think about long-distance trade and prioritize it above local, but here in Singapore, most of the shopping you do is from your local mall to buy food, bread, milk that you don't write about. And then when you buy something expensive in Ho Chi Minh City or in London, that's the thing you write about because it's unusual. But the connectivities are not just about the 2 extreme points, they're about what happens also in between. That's one of the main things of the Silk Roads too. I mentioned about ideas about Pan-Asian groupings. In fact, I suppose, thinking about it on the way over to Singapore, to think about other ways in which this can be expressed. And it's true, BRICS is not an Asian phenomenon, although it is primarily driven by states in Asia. BRICS, these countries highlighted in red, now covers about 45% of the world's GDP and 55% of the world's population if you put in all the observer status. I suppose one of the things that unites this movement, and there's lots of noise within the BRICS group in countries, lots of different visions about what it could be, and in fact lots of different visions about even what it is. One of the things that unites these countries and the BRICS grouping is that this is a group that doesn't include the West. And although Brazil sits somewhere within that sort of slightly grey area, of course for lots of different reasons, Argentina that had been accepted and then withdrew by Milei at the end of last year, that there is a way of trying to think about a conceptualization about how people can trade with each other while cutting other people out of the story. And those ideas with BRICS, if you follow, as I'm sure you will have done, meetings at Kazan last year, the discussions in some areas of the BRICS is it possible for BRICS to be thinking about either monopolizing or certainly having the ability to set prices of products like agrarian products and wheat, crops, food, but also metals as well as potential new banking systems, partly to avoid sanctions, but also to allow states to survive without the threat of US economic coercion. So although this is not absolutely an Asian thing, by the time you tot up the member states that sit within the BRICS, and by nature of how it is run and focused, this looks like sort of something that is pan-Asian. Now, I'm very interested in corridors and connectivities. I have behind me a slide showing the top 10 container throughputs. None of these none of the major ports in the world are in the US or Europe. This tells me where volumes of trade are moving. Sometimes we think again about these improvements outside countries, but in India we've seen a massive improvement in investment in things like roads, fiber cables, train lines, but also the port infrastructure and international airports have doubled in number over the last 5 years as India starts to invest on a massive scale in its own future. UAE, which last year put nearly 4 times more money into Africa, not only into ports, 4 times more than than China did. So these multipoles are states that we spend not a lot of time thinking about how they see their future. Vietnam last year alone putting 1,000 billion dong into its road networks. As you become more prosperous, your investment in infrastructure capabilities rises, and as you improve connectivities, roads, ports, airports, digital networks, those efficiencies scroll through quite quickly. So you see standards of living that change dramatically. So since China joined the WTO in 2001, its economy has grown by about 17 times, but the growth of China has also brought about the growth and driven lots of growth in Southeast Asia, not just because China's a primary catalyst, but because the whole region has done well from the process of globalization. So I've got lots of statistics I could give you till the cows come home, but one that shows it scale is that in 1984, Bangladesh's garments industry was worth $34 million. Today it's worth nearly $30 billion. So everyone's done well from that share of global prosperity and globalization. And ironically, this globalization has been very good for the West too. It's been good for the West, and there are lots of different ways you can slice this up. It's made us much cleaner because we've managed to put environmental damage onto other parts of the world rather than have things made by dirty industries in rich countries. That has a price to pay, of course, and a responsibility too. It's made us economically wealthier because we've been able to afford more goods made at cheaper factory conditions. The cost of an iPhone, if it was made in LA or in Sheffield, would be a lot higher than being put together in Foxconn factories in China or now in India. And it's also therefore made us more democratic, because if you can afford luxury goods that are not just in the domain of the wealthy, then having flat screen TVs and Nespresso machines, probably that has some benefits for it too. So it doesn't have to be East or West. The world rises and falls together. That's a theme I'm going to come back to for the last few minutes of my talk. I'm going to talk through a few of these multipoles very quickly of places that are on the move, because we don't spend a lot of time thinking of them. So here across Asia, I'm not going to talk too much about China, because you all know about this world too. And in fact, I'm going to pick out a few places that will all be familiar. But we're seeing a world of states that are having wider geographical and political ambitions. So one is Turkey, or Türkiye, as now we're being encouraged to call it by Turkish diplomats. Turkey has the third largest diplomatic corps of any country in the world now. The investment into foreign affairs is very dramatic indeed. The largest diplomatic mission that Turkey hosts overseas is in Somalia in East Africa. And it probably pays us all well, wherever we're living in the world, to be trying to think about why that is. Erdogan has been in charge of Turkey for a long time. There's a cartoon, Vabir Ya Halimiz, which means I have a dream. It's a reference to Martin Luther King, who I suspect has not the same political views as Erdogan, but the idea of a reconstitution, maybe not of Turkish territory, but certainly of Turkish influence. And we've seen that with Erdogan being in Egypt, which I thought I had on my slides, being in Egypt with President Trump and President Sisi, being highly interventionist in Syria, but also mediating discussions and relationships between Russia and Ukraine, highly active, and including into Central Asia, where now in Turkish schoolrooms and universities, you are not allowed to call this region Central Asia, you have to call it Turkestan. And that's something that Turkish diplomats lobby very heavily at the United Nations, which causes a problem, because that's not how other countries, most notably China, like to refer to this region. So it's a world of growing ambitions for the Turks. Obviously, it's a world of growing ambitions for Israel. Theodor Herzl, father of Zionism in the late 19th, early 20th century, thinking about what a greater Israel would look like, relating to the biblical works of the Old Testament, or the Torah, I should say. And then over the last 6 months, we've seen expansion of Israel's footprint very dramatically that you don't need me to think and talk about. There he is. There's Erdogan. Here showing Qatar, which is deeply engaged both in negotiations over Gaza, but also hosting the Taliban, investing in the World Cup. And in fact, Qatar is the reason why the best football team in Europe today is Paris Saint-Germain, which just won the Champions League a few months ago, owned by the Qatari ruling family. We find places like Azerbaijan. I know how much you guys spend in Singapore on your education and how much you follow the world from RSIS and elsewhere. But places like Azerbaijan are doing things around the world to maximize their leverage. Azerbaijan is a small state, it's got a smaller population than Singapore. A friend of mine a few months ago got in touch and said, I think you need to be following what's happening in the South Pacific. As Warren knows, because having read my book, I've learned a lot about the South Pacific in the last few years, trying to think about how these networks I cover should be globally inclusive. But I wasn't expecting to find any connection with Azerbaijan. This is the people, members of the Kanak indigenous population of New Caledonia in the South Pacific, who were protesting against proposed changes to the French constitution. New Caledonia is part of France. This vestige of not all European empires are quite over quite yet. But you'll notice the flag waving at the front is not the Kanak flag, although it's reasonably similar colours. This is the flag of the Republic of Azerbaijan, which is about 15,000 kilometres away. This gentleman here is interviewed and asked, who is this man standing in front of a flag with his fist raised? And he said, I'm not sure, but he is a good man. This is President Aliyev of Azerbaijan, and this is the Azerbaijan War Memorial, because Azerbaijan took a view that when it had its war and dispute with Armenia, it took offence at comments made by the French foreign minister and the French president, and decided that therefore Azerbaijan should use its very substantial wealth to show that two can play that game and be disruptive. And it turns out that you can use your strategic advantage in ways that can force, in this case, the French president to fly 22 hours to get to Nouméa in New Caledonia, tell everyone to calm down, it's all going to be fine, and then 22 hours to fly back in the other direction. So these are states that feel that they have a global ability to influence global affairs. And in fact, in the case of Azerbaijan, it is part now of the Abraham Accords and has signed a comprehensive strategy agreement with Beijing, the People's Republic of China. That should strike us as a dramatic change to how the world has been configured for many years in the past. I mentioned a bit about China. Although the tariffs have had an impact on Chinese goods, they're down about 70%. This is a chart that I saw this morning on Bloomberg. China's still exporting $1 billion of goods per day to the United States. So even with change and dramatic change, things can be maybe not quite as bad as they sound. And as it happens, because so much is flowing through different parts of the world, particularly through Vietnam, if you put PRC-owned businesses, SMEs together, probably roughly about where you were already, and maybe even slightly above. So the death of globalization, I think we may be going to see it, but I think not quite yet. I'm going to do quickly 3 case studies, just so those of you who are historians feel that you're rewarded for coming to hear me. And if you'd like to ask about these, I'll be thrilled. But just to emphasize the importance of connections and of some of the themes that tie these all together. So I'll start with before the Bronze Age even, actually, about how things have made the world that we have through connections and through corridors. One is to do with things like the dispersal of crops from, in this case, of rice, the primary provider of calories across all of Asia, in fact globally, about how the domestication of rice crops enabled more people to live more densely together, because if you have secure food supply, you can have population growth. Particularly if you have food supply that is robust, then you can start to store food, and you can think about how you control your populations and how you do things in slightly different ways, which I'll mention. We have something similar looking at, for example, at cereal grains that are moving across very large distances, partly transported by the peoples of the steppes, the nomadic peoples, who are one of the great conveyor belts of spreads of languages, of ideas, and above all of horses along these Silk Roads, and then into the different parts of South and Southeast Asia too. It's not just foods. Here on the map behind me, you have to strain your eyes. It's about the spread of cannabis use in Asia. And I'm reliably informed by my students that cannabis as a psychometric allows people to enjoy feelings of great euphoria and to feel that they've got profound insights into the world around. And I've seen enough movies that tell me that that is the case. I understand that tobacco is more or less illegal vaping is illegal in Singapore, right? So this is definitely illegal in Singapore. Cannabis illegal in Singapore. Don't try it at home. But the spread of this, why I'm interested in this, is not because about psychotropic drugs. It's because there's an obvious correlation between ideas about reaching higher planes that lots of indigenous groups do too, as well as students, but the idea about what this means for religions, for rituals, for spiritual ideas. And those movements are happening many thousands of years ago. So the earliest marker on here we find with the black square in everything always starts in Ukraine, by the way, about 6,000 years ago, and then being spread as people work out how to find a way of communing with things that feel supernatural. It's an incredibly important way of building societal groups to empower shamans, to empower religious thinking, and to provide cohesions. And another one which does something very similar, it's the distribution of metals. And it looks like metals, this is written by some colleagues of mine recently, that what seems to be crucial to the establishment of cities is the location of metals and metal mines and the cost of getting metals to larger populations. So, as I've written about in my books, obviously having environmentally secure niches with plentiful water, good disease environments, or rather where disease environments are not dangerous for malaria or dengue, etc. That explains one thing. Good fields, good crop, good soils, good soil chemistry, for example, to grow crops, obviously is important, but metals seems to be one of the things that helps harness the growth of cities. And the growth of cities is obviously quite closely correlated to defences, to controls of population, and also to military technologies. So metals doesn't just allow you to chop things up quicker, it allows you to make better weapons and better armour. And if you have better weapons and better armour, that changes gender balances too, because you start to prioritise. We see this when written scripts start to be created about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, cuneiform, Linear A, Indus Valley scripts, that tends to allow for the formation of hierarchies, both priestly hierarchies, whether they're having cannabis or not, but to be interpreting the divine, but also to political rulers who will emphasize the importance of military leadership, of bravery, of male characteristics, and that changes gender balances too. All sits within this context of who's trading what and how is their competition for the best kinds of resources. So in the Bronze Age and those growth of first early cities, the ways in which you have the purpose of those writing scripts, as I said, I had a dinner with a very senior figure at PwC the other night, one of the world's great accountancy firms, that we have accountants to thank for the world's great literatures, because states need to write down who owns things, they need to collect tax, and when you can control tax flows, then who gets the benefits of those incomes are decided at state level, and that creates social and economic structures and political ones too. So in that early histories, we see how important these connections are, the borrowings, the rivalries, the connectivities, and the interactions between different regions. I call it a medieval golden age because if you are wealthy, golden ages are ones where there's relatively low levels of interpersonal violence. A golden age is great if you're rich. It's not necessarily so good if you're poor, but it's a golden age insofar as we see interconnected worlds, as Walter Lieberman calls them, parallel empires that run across the whole of Asia, linking into interconnected worlds, where we have here, for example, the Hall of the Ambassadors in what's now Samarkand in Central Asia, Uzbekistan, but to see interlocking large states that work together. And the function of those large states is to provide stability. And when you have stability, you find investments, as you find in all of these reports of whether they're on the maritime Silk Roads, whether they're on oasis-linked Silk Roads like Samarkand was, or the steppe Silk Roads, you find a very strong incentive to provide the circumstances for prosperity and stability. And if you can provide stability, then you have, I think it's Xi Jinping keeps calling it win-win, but it's what most people call that everybody gets a slice of the pie. And those are very helpful in terms of trying to encourage and focus the minds to encourage large-scale cooperation. And prosperity is a good thing for states because it allows investment in more roads, into bureaucracies, into scholarships, into science, into literature, into art. The problem is when things go wrong for everybody. So single breaks in the chain can break the whole thing down. So when you get the failure or catastrophic failure sometimes of states, sometimes with climate factors involved, sometimes through force of personality. You have different kinds of reactions where everybody also loses at the same time. As it happens in the case of Asia, you have the greatest single land empire in history of the Mongols that creates a single united zone that links Central Europe to the Korean Peninsula. The Mongols did one thing that they should be ashamed of, which they didn't pay for historians to write their story. So the Mongol histories are written by others, and therefore we see the Mongols as a negative example of violence rather than one of profound speed of information flow, of connectivities, and of the artistic production. Because amongst the things that the Mongols do first when they capture a city or encourage a city to surrender is to take the artisans and bring them back to Karakoram, in the same way that I've ended up in RSIS, elite capture of getting the best minds, getting the best artisans to come and spark new ideas is what you should do if you can afford to do that. Then something happens similar, I suppose, in the modern era, where we will hear lots about Zheng He, and I put that slide there simply to say that it's not just Western Europeans who are trying to discover things, it's about connections across lots of different kinds of networks. But of course the primary brokers of these large empires, first of all, are in Asia. So this is what my colleague William McNeill calls gunpowder empires, of the Ottomans in what's roughly the sort of Turkish world of triple continental empire, Europe, Asia and Africa, the Safavids of Persia, and then the Mughals of India, the first people to unite the Indian subcontinent properly, a few little gaps down in the south, in what's now Tamil Nadu and Kerala, Central Asian grouping, and you could add this through to Ming Dynasty, China too, these large conglomerated states that are creating pan-Asian empires that are looking at each other, learning from each other, and also competing with each other, sometimes through not just warfare, but through brutal warfare. But these interactions don't involve Europeans or the West. Until the age of new technologies, of the ocean-going ship that allows Europeans to build empires that colonize pretty much every single part of the world. And the colors behind me represent different shades of different European empires: Portuguese, Spanish, French, Russians, who pushed into Asia at a rate of adding 55 square miles per day on average after 1812. So Putin and Lavrov like to say that the Russians have never colonized anybody. I don't think that's absolutely correct. And then, of course, the British, who managed to have a quarter of the world colored in red or pink by the time of the First World War. That includes having lost the United States of America by that point. You see these European empires, mostly familiar with the Spanish and the Portuguese, but even the Swedes, the Danes, who still have substantial territories in the case of Greenland, for example, the ways in which monopolies of these trade routes means that all the benefits, of course, flow to Europeans. So it's as the Europeans build ocean-going ships, build their own versions of whatever you want to call it, Belt and Road Initiative, they build their own connectivities of linking ports together that allow you to move from London to Hong Kong via ports in West Africa, Southern Africa, India, Singapore, and beyond. Joining these worlds up together is about control of networks, linking regions together, and getting the benefits. So I started at the beginning saying, well, what do we think of Asia? Is it something that's real or not? And one of the things that is interesting, I spend a lot of time traveling in these different parts of the world, is that there are lots of things that people, when you ask young people what do they think they're worried about, they all say the same thing. And I've had this repeated to me again and again here in Singapore. They're worried here today about social mobility, about inclusivity, and about what society looks like in the future. That the anxiety that the last two generations have had so many benefits, will the next generations be able to share those, or will they spend their whole time being told how lucky they are? That's something you hear in UAE, that's something you hear in Kazakhstan, that's something you hear in Vietnam, in China, and Singapore, India too. Those challenges and those questions, those anxieties. How do you find a way of keeping Gen Z happy? And it's perhaps no coincidence that we've seen in the last 12 months 3 governments in Asia toppled by Gen Z protests in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, and in Nepal. And we've seen some of these Gen Z movements now cropping up elsewhere too, in Latin America, and I suspect that will be the beginning of it. But these are common problems that are shared across all these different parts of the world. As it happens, many parts of Asia are not free in terms of their religious expression, freedoms of expression of worship, sexuality, gender, and so on. And by every metric, since 2015, these countries, by and large, measured, have become less free. Sometimes in marginal ways, but in ways in which you can benchmark. So, a few conclusions before some questions. One is, Trump said this a couple of days ago, for which he was roundly mocked, saying, you go to war, we're not doing a trade deal, how he prevented the India-Pakistan conflict. Now, everybody will be telling me that Trump wants to win a Nobel Prize. I suspect that he sleeps at night perfectly well without having one. But I think he's not necessarily always wrong about things. What Trump is trying to say is that if we can make sure that everybody has incentives to cooperate, then they will. And what those incentives are either taken away, or you have a calculus that you can use your strategic competitive advantage, then you upset the whole apple cart. So I think that those ideas of how to encourage regional connectivity and even global connectivity in a time of these interlocking revolutions is going to define the 21st century, not just in Asia, but for Asia and individual countries too. For what it's worth, and I mentioned something about the unities of what we think of in Asia. This is a report produced by McKinsey last year, looking at things that you would want to see if you're trying to see progress and change. So patent applications, I tried to feed Singapore into this, and well, the data wouldn't show me, but anyway, here's China's patents, but looking across at about what kinds of papers, where the best scholars in the world being focused. If you'd asked in the same way, if you'd asked 150 years ago, you wouldn't have had a US institution in the top 10. They would all been in the UK and Europe. Now that's shifted. That's now also shifting again. We're seeing centres of real academic excellence pop up in lots of different kinds of parts of Asia. This is, I'm afraid, not an easy chart to see, but in terms of world-class patents, the blue sign is the blue line here is the one to be looking at, about world-class patents for electrification and renewables, Web3, advanced connectivity, applied AI, generative AI. If you're investing in scholarship and new ideas, then you are approaching the future with the best toolkit available. Same way, again, this from the AXI report that came out just a couple of months ago. It's a bit crude showing flags. This hides lots of detail and depth. But to look at some of the countries that are ahead in things like nanoscale materials, coatings, smart materials, you'll see that there are good US representation, but otherwise we're seeing a world, for example, Iran features on this quite often for some obvious reasons. And then when you take a snapshot of the whole thing, I've only taken these ones here. The chart on the right shows what are the risks of monopolies. All governments, all corporations want, if they possibly can, to get into monopolistic positions, because if you have a monopoly, you have other people who are vulnerable. So it's quite a smart thing to be thinking like that. That's what the East India Company did. That is what corporations as well as states are very keen to do. And suddenly when you find yourself at the opposite end of this, you have to mobilize quickly. You have to spend more than you otherwise would have done. And again, I'm not here to defend a Trump White House or to explain how US education is going, but I think it's fair to say in the last 10 months, the realization that the US is behind in a core set of these technologies and skills will lead to massive investment into trying to redress that. Where that leads, it's a different story, but generally, as a football fan and as an academic, the more competition, the better, because it encourages innovation. And in fact, the more small innovations there are, the more the global benefits will be. So I'm quite positive in thinking that this doesn't have to end in a nuclear catastrophe. I said I'd end with something about Singapore. I'm particularly interested in the histories of connectivities, about who provides the oil that makes things work. And the peoples that play the most interesting role, from my perspective, are smaller groups and minorities, for lots of different reasons. So I've got here the Sogdians. That's from I say mine, I'm sorry, I don't own it. Other people work on this subject too. This is from the Hall of Ambassadors in Samarkand in Uzbekistan. I have Chettiars here on the left, moneylenders who are extremely important in the monetary economies of South and Southeast Asia. I have a medallion from a ship that sank. This is in the museum in Singapore. I took a photo of it yesterday, of the Asian civilizations, and here the Armenian church. The ways in which small groups have played a role in facilitating trade, of being financial brokers, of taking risk, of connecting people together who perhaps don't naturally want to be connected or don't find a way of doing so regularly. And I suppose Singapore fits neatly within that role. It's a small state and a small country, as I keep being told, despite the fact it's a very powerful one. I will, when Singapore qualifies for the World Cup, try and offer my services to play for Singapore. I gather that's a little bit harder than I thought for lots of reasons, but one of the things that I think should make you feel very happy here is the number of your population that anticipates leaving the country in the next 12 months. When you travel, when you learn about other people, when you see how they live, what they listen to, what they study, when you interact with other people, that is the glue that makes the world keep on turning. So these kinds of things about being exposed to different cultures, different beliefs, different climates, different environments, different scholarly environments, is one of the reasons why RSIS exists. I think it's one of the reasons why S.T. Lee and his foundation founded these kinds of lectures, is because to try to emphasize the importance of exchange. Because the reason I'm here today is to talk to you, but it's also to try to come and listen and to think about what those multipolar worlds of the future are going to look like and what it is that people want and need to choose peace rather than what else is on offer on the other side, which I can promise you is much, much worse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for that very broad sort of historical sweep, looking at history and culture and technologies, because you've given us quite a lot to think about. We're going to come to questions. We've got about half an hour. Let me get the ball rolling by trying to sort of relate some of what you've said to some of what's going on in the world at the moment. I mean, the last year or so, we've all been sort of watching events play out, and there's a sense of anxiety, almost bewilderment at the end of the unipolar moment, right? And people say we're in uncharted waters, and it's almost as though the world's come to an end. But I'd like to get your sense, given that historical sweep that you are so adept at, if you could give us sort of some examples of previous situations when we had one era suddenly fade away and then a transition into something quite new and quite different, and how that played out.
Okay, well, I'll start by answering the question you didn't, that I thought you were going to ask, which is, are we living in an age of change and should be worried? Again, let's start with 50% of the population globally. Any woman giving birth today has the longest life expectancy in human history. Their child will have the longest life expectancy in human history, the greatest access to clean water, and the greatest ability to likelihood to be literate. And that is a huge mark of progress for us globally. So sometimes dividing the world into different camps and thinking, is there a West, is there an East, who's winning, who's losing? I think it's one of those things that sometimes we in think tanks and universities can get over-obsessed about. So when you say, well, we've all been watching, I know I'm in very distinguished company here, but normally most people haven't been watching what's been happening in Mexico or in Latin America or in sub-Saharan Africa. 85% of the world's population don't live in the West, and yet everybody in this room not only knows the name of Donald Trump and probably all of his children, but they know who Nigel Farage is. And they know who the president of France is. I think that there are lots of new eras being born all the time, and historically, that's the mushrooming up of new centres of opportunity that happens so often. I mean, you can pick out whichever ones you like. I think it's a different story though to where are there moments where suddenly people will flourish. I mean, for example, the Tang Dynasty wreck that you have here in the museum, which had 30,000 pieces of ceramics, silver ingots, beautiful vases and ewers being transported almost certainly from the eastern coast of China heading for Basra and for Baghdad, tells you that the key driver of global trade, even into the modern era, is the rise of cities, urbanization. The bigger the cities, the bigger your base of consumers, and by and large the level of wealth that can be generated. So if you want to look at change, it's when do people start to move to cities in the past, and how does that drive global trading patterns? So I suppose in the 8th century, Baghdad is founded in 762. If you see how cities in the Middle East start to blossom through benefits of trade, prosperity, good governance, and so on, the disposable incomes rise, and that encourages people to take the risk of sailing a ship a really very long way from eastern China, where if your ship with that kind of consignment sinks, you'd think that somebody goes bust at the other end if they don't get paid. So I think you have these changes all the time. I mean, the most seismic and unusual ones are in the 1490s when Europeans start to have a platform to build their global empires. But that takes quite a long time when it comes to Africa and Asia. It takes 300 years for Europeans to think about being able to colonize Africa. They then do it quite quickly. But I think it depends whether you think that we're in an age where the Belt and Road Initiative building transport networks in Astana in Kazakhstan or power plants in Pakistan really signifies the change of a new world order. So with BRICS and with these countries that I've been talking about, the rise, the demand for reform, the demand for the global south to have bigger voices, that all is recognizable. It even sounds logical, but what it actually means in practice is not completely clear. And if we had a reform, let's say, of the Security Council of the UN with 10 members instead of 5, or including India, which no problem, kick off the British, kick off the French, whoever you like. What I want to know is, does that make global governance better, or is it just a cosmetic shifting of the seats, of the deck chairs? So I think that demand for a global reform and of a new order being built sounds great, but I'm not absolutely sure what it actually really means. And that new world order to us probably means the fact that we have by and large managed to get along with each other quite well, with a few obvious hotspot exceptions where the suffering has been epic in the last 30, 40 years, including recently, both in Gaza but in Ukraine too. But by and large, I think it's do you need to have the birth of a new world order? Does there have to be the rise of one and the fall of the other? Or surely isn't it that we all rise but in slightly different speeds and ways?
I mean, one of the things I've taken away from your books is that history doesn't just go in straight lines, right? It often ebbs and flows, it twists and turns, and there are many other forces that can shift from one plane to another. It could be the climate, it could be an individual. Right.
Well, look at Singapore. When the British left in 1971, apart from the number of people the British employed, it was 20% of Singapore's GDP disappeared more or less overnight. So those shocks, like I said at the beginning, they can be devastating, but they also provide huge opportunities. And I think that it's true that we could be apocalyptic, but I think if one thinks in terms of opportunities and where there are benefits and where there's where there are chances to do good and to do well, probably that's just as useful a conversation to have.
Why don't we open up the conversation to folks in the room? Anyone with questions, please just raise your hand. We'll get a mic to you. Just please tell us who you are, and then we'll take your question. And maybe we'll take a few questions together. Anyone from the floor?
Chelsea won 5-0 last night, if anybody wants to ask that question. I can tell you the scorers too.
Yes, please. Kwang.
Thank you. Han Fuk Kwang from RSIS. I have a question about global trade, which I think you've spent quite a bit of time telling us what happened in the past. I suppose the big question for most people on global trade is that, we're never going to return to the era of globalization and free and open trade, which was, a landmark of how it was, 10, 20 years ago. And many people believe that with Trump in the US and what he's doing, we're entering a new era. So many people have said it that it's almost sounds like the gospel truth these days. I just heard the Prime Minister of Singapore in a recent interview with the Financial Times making the same point, that we're never going to go back to that period. So I want to get your views on it. First of all, A, do you believe it to be so? And if it is so, what sort of world will it be? How will the new connections be made? What sort of new trade connections are likely to emerge? And lastly, because you're a historian, I can't resist asking you this question. Have we seen in the past this sort of a situation where trade is weaponized by rival countries? What was the outcome of this, if indeed it has happened? And are there any lessons from what has happened in the past? Thank you.
Sure, great questions.
Is there another question we can take? Yes, please, this lady. Yeah. And then the gentleman.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hi. So I'm Sun Bibi. I was previously the writing skills tutor in RSIS. So my question, actually, as a follow-up of his question, is about, I mean, I must thank you for a very optimistic message, but I'm just thinking about climate change and the disasters that are brought about by climate change, and how is that going to affect how we foresee to be the trade relations and, in the future. I think we are seeing much more natural disasters like typhoons and so forth. And also, I'm very concerned about the mining of like rare earth and how that is actually bring even more destruction to our environment. So, so how do we see, I mean, like, is that going to be something that will actually temper our very optimistic view of the future? Thank you.
Okay. And the gentleman, yeah.
I'm Henry Chen of Cambodia Center for Regional Studies. Just this month, the Chinese vessel of carrying 5,000 containers from Ningpo to the British port in less than 20 days.
Yeah.
Now, this was much faster than everybody expected.
Yeah.
So how is this change of China-Europe maritime route going to affect the strategic pictures of the world? Because control of strategic choke point is always a very interesting topic. And how is it going to affect the Russian positions in this trade map?
Yeah. Great. Those are three fantastic questions individually, and as it happens, it's a beautiful set of questions together because they'll run seamlessly from one to the other, if I can remember them. The first one about globalization, look, I think that there are two points. One is that follow the numbers and the data and the evidence rather than the noise. So at the moment, our global trade flows are getting higher every single year. Here across the ASEAN region, the expectations of what will happen within ASEAN trade, short of warfare, catastrophe, climate change, are extremely bullish. The growth is expected to rise. China, although its straightforward exports to the United States have dropped substantially, lots have been funneled through Vietnam in particular, but through other countries too. So I think there is a concern about, particularly from the United States point of view, that more and more things have a national security element, and as they say in the US, the yard gets bigger with higher fences around it. I think that there are key areas where that is an issue of concern for the United States in particular, particularly in advanced technologies, but those are not particularly difficult problems to solve. They're solved by funding and making funding available. And I would suspect that we're already at the beginning of proper attempts to correct things like rare earth, critical minerals, et cetera, where there's a lot happening behind the scenes that you'll know about here from RSIS in the US and elsewhere too, to be ready for the revolutions that are coming towards us for energy and the ways in which we'll use these new technologies. How those new technologies will actually work in practice is a bit more complicated. For what it's worth, how the US will do it with rare earths, what it looks like they'll do is they will, rather than having to wait for lawyers to give them permission, because rare earths are not particularly rare, it's just they're dirty, but they will mine on US government land, so it makes it easy for them to bypass legal procedures. And in any event, in cases where they do get challenged, the Department of War has the right to be able to overrule. So there are ways in which that can get solved. If you want American flags or British flags or German flags or Singaporean flags on all of these scientific technologies, it's how much money do you want to spend? And to put that into context, China spent about $100 billion on renewable technologies to achieve near monopoly. And that's not a huge amount of money. That's less than we spend on our NHS service in a year in the UK, right, to have a dominant position. So if you want to be thinking strategically, you align investment outcomes and the brain power manufacturing you need to make it all happen. I do think that the bigger challenge, which is important to flag, and I didn't say about it in my talk, is the challenges from the US side is easy to see. The China side, and to some extent here in Southeast Asia too, it's how do you manage the change of your economy from mass production and manufacturing into a consumer-based society? And that I think is a real challenge for PRC. per capita income in China is about $12,000 a head. US, it's about 70,000. To encourage China, we've seen lots of jobs move out of China into Vietnam, Bangladesh, etc. Funnily enough, not much into India, not into Turkey too. Manufacturing will chase low-cost production, and China has to work out how to handle that process in a way that very few countries have managed to do, to go from a low-income country to median and then high income. So there are challenges on that side too. In terms of the historical parallel, the Ming dynasty dealt with globalization by putting up the biggest wall possible and blocking everybody out, and that turned out to be a bad bet. You probably need to be thinking about how you can cherry pick the best bits of what happens, rather than try and put your head under a pillow and pretend it's not happening, however tempting that might sound. So I think there are plenty of cases where states take a highly defensive decision. Japan was something similar, and it builds up problems over multi-generation and leads to longer-term exposure and vulnerability. Look, I couldn't agree more about climate and the change. Hopefully I've answered some of the rare earth element of the question. I think here in Singapore, I've been through some of your NatSec documents and some of your national strategies about what some of the median and worst case scenarios look like for Singapore, where 30% of your population live less than 5 meters above sea level. Sea level's been going up 3 millimeters per year since the early 1990s. As you mentioned, storms, hurricanes. In the worst case projections, by 2050, you'll have 350 days a year of more than 35 degrees centigrade temperatures. And that brings down per worker productivity by 25%. That means you become less efficient. That's one of the challenges of being in a tropical climate. And as you mentioned, storms, you're here in Singapore part of a global insurance business, so premiums that mean that bad storms in the US or here or India mean that costs go up. And with food supply, where 90% of your food comes from abroad, then you're highly exposed to inflationary measures that you literally can't control. And that creates social cohesion problems, as well as more practical ones. At dinner last night, we were talking about AC and its lack of availability in lower income households here in Singapore. That's already a challenge. It becomes a real difficulty in a warming world. So I think there are lots of things to be thinking about with the environmental piece, and some of that about how government chooses to be interventionist and anticipate those. You mentioned the shipping routes. You mean the Polar Silk Road, as China calls it. China's called itself now a near Arctic state, and has a Polar Silk Road which allows traffic and transit to go from Chinese ports over the northern course of Russia into the North Sea and into Europe. That poses multiple challenges. From a European point of view, we are concerned about the militarization of northern Arctic space. We're concerned about what that means for opportunism, for if you can get commercial shipping around that direction, are there ways in which other types of ships can come too? From a Chinese perspective, it seems to be entirely logical and sensible to get your goods to rich markets as cheaply and as quickly as you possibly can. So the Northern Polar Route provides new opportunities to use your capital better. It provides another route that takes pressure off choke points, both of Straits of Taiwan, but also Malacca Straits, etc. That provides optionality, which is probably quite a useful thing. I think that we can over-exaggerate how thrilled the Russians are about Chinese shipping on its back door. And there's much more complexity to the relationship across the board between Beijing and Moscow than perhaps meets the eye, but specifically when it comes to the so-called Northern Sea Route. So what that looks like from the perspective of Russia is extremely significant, because what the form of militarization that Russia will choose to do and how it wants to keep its own options open with probably a dominant economic partner has questions too. But I think there's no doubt that these new routes that will open up will pose all the same types of things I've been talking about today: military vulnerabilities, economic opportunities, swift use of capital, and strong incentives for people to work out how to get on with each other. But that's probably easier said than done at the moment.
Can I follow up on that idea of the three trade-related questions, and then related to your idea of that pan-Asian society, right? The trade flows that actually brought people together, had that incentive to work together. But if we look at history, there have been times when Admiral Cheng Ho's expeditions were suddenly halted because the Ming Empress decided they weren't getting very much out of it. A bit like Donald Trump feeling that he's not getting the full benefit out of that trade, and they stopped building boats, they burned his boats. The risk of something like that reversal of that value of trade, is something I think people are worried about. And you talked about how we might find new ways of connecting Asia, right? I mean, the sense of the younger generation and what they value. Apart from trade, what would you see as other driving forces that might bring people together? Because in Asia, we see the deep historical divisions within countries, between countries, much more so than in Europe, right?
Yeah.
The nationalism, the very strong nationalisms. How do you see that sense of pan-Asian collective
which is, of course,
solidarity?
deeply ironic, because our history in Europe is bloodshed after bloodshed. There wasn't a single decade between 1350 and 1950 that didn't involve a war between European states. And just to give a sense of scale, these Mercator projection maps are not helpful that I showed. So Western Europe is the same. It's smaller than Kazakhstan, and the central point geographically of Asia is by Urumqi in China. So China covers half the Asian landmass. So although you might feel that there are problems and grievances that have scarred the history of Asia, in fact, in the quantum, the histories of imperial compression, contraction, and confrontation are much, much lower by a massive factor than they are in Europe. The problem is that it's the fault of it's not just me, but of historians. As Hegel said, the pages of peace and prosperity are the ones that historians pass over in silence. So people want to talk about clashes and warfare, assassinations, corridors of power where emperors and rulers get murdered, and of big battles. But by and large, those processes of exchange have been quite fluid, quite efficient, and quite sensible. You find writers in the 7th century, writers in the 11th century, saying, I can travel from one end of Asia more or less to the other without any fear of my security. Because, a bit like in Singapore today, they didn't have CCTV and a good police force, but because rulers want to encourage and foster good relationships and trade. And by and large, those disputes between religious factions tended to be kept to a minimum because most countries have always had religious minorities within them. There were probably more Christians in Asia until 1400 than there were in Europe. Probably more Christians in lands controlled by Arabs and by Muslims, probably for 500 years after the great Arab conquests. It's because people get on with it. The incentive to punish people with different religious beliefs comes often from priests, but rulers are quite good at telling priests that they'll just give them more money for their monasteries or for their madrasas or for whatever it is. And in fact, we find that in Pagan. The reason why the great empire Pagan collapsed, probably because monks were so good at getting gifts and tax breaks from the king that it toppled the economy of the state over, because eventually the monasteries owned too much land and didn't pay any tax. So I think you can find statements of confrontation everywhere you look. But by and large, the benign flow of traffic and goods, there obviously have been flashpoints, and the War of 1738, the sacking of Delhi, the expansion of Qing dynasty into Xinjiang, etc. There are lots of moments where it's not all people holding hands and singing songs together, but those rhythms of exchange have been much more natural in terms of what does expansion look like, and therefore what does even colonialism look like, and what's dissemination and competition of ideas. So those grievances you have, it's because you've been told that you have them and need to have them, rather than necessarily them acting as being big drivers of dramatic change.
Next questions from gentleman at the back, please. And then the lady in green will come to you in a minute.
Good afternoon. So I'm Utkarsh. I'm currently a grade 9 student, and I do want to ask about your opinions, because if we look at the current state, we have a few states which currently hold more diversified assets compared to US gold bonds, and we also have the US accumulating greater debt as it has in recent years compared to any other point in history.
The US having...
Huh?
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said. Having the greatest debts.
And the US has found itself with increasing debt in the past few years compared to at any other point in history.
Yeah.
Do you feel that the decline in Western supremacy has been accelerated by a reduced confidence in the international scene regarding the presence of the US dollar as the international federal reserve and like the reserve currency itself?
And when you say Western supremacy, you mean specifically the United States, or you mean West?
Western as its whole with a bit more specifics towards the US.
But and you need to be specific because they're different answers.
Sure, the US then.
US, okay.
Okay, let's get the mic to the lady in green so we can take the second question, and then that gentleman over there. We'll take three together, and then I think we might run out of time. Yeah.
Professor Frankopan, thank you so much for the very insightful presentation. I'm Nimisha, I'm from RSIS. So my question is about India. You seem to have studied the Indian subcontinent in a lot of detail. Based on that, are there any specific predictions that you see for India in terms of its economy and its global position in the global order?
Is there any?
India's position in the global order.
Yes, just generally.
Generally?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
The gentleman over there.
Thank you. These are great questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Most interesting. Trade is typically beset with rules and regulations and taxes. And I'm curious, in your study of the Silk Roads, was there a parallel? And was the parallel one of increased regulatory issues at any one time?
Okay. Gosh, okay. Good, but tricky. Has anyone have an easy question? Should we take one final? I'll do four, and then I can see the sign saying, please be quiet.
So you've got 4 questions in 4 minutes.
4 minutes, yeah.
I'm Charlie. The words right above your head say ponder the improbable. So I'm wondering if you could finish out with, what is the most improbable but risky thing that we might,
improbable, yeah, okay,
that we might face here in this in the world?
Yeah. Okay. That's a good one to end with. Do you want to end on a happy note or a sad note? US debt, look, it's $35 trillion. The government shut down second longest time in history. I think that the death of the United States is easy to exaggerate and anticipate. Lots of people want to see it happen. I think one should be careful what one wishes for, follow the numbers and play the ball, not the man. There's no question that Trump looks and is chaotic, but it doesn't mean he's always wrong. It also doesn't mean that the US economy, its defense, its soft power, its international ability to try to forge a world that might look like it's only serving US interests, but perhaps does more than that. So I was 10 days ago with the president of DRC and the prime minister of Armenia, president of Rwanda, high-level delegation of Southeast Asia at the European Union in Brussels for its global gateway. And there's no question that US interventions in some parts of the world have been extremely beneficial. We want to laugh at Trump, and you're welcome to do that. My job isn't to either laugh or to cry. It's to try to stick to the facts. And I think that some of those interventions that the US has done in places like Pakistan and India have actually been meaningful and are not to be entirely laughed at. So the commentariat thinking that Trump is a narcissist who wants the Nobel Prize for not doing anything, I think perhaps just needs a slight kind of correction. So that US national debt is obviously, you need to take a calculation whether you think the SWIFT banking system is there to be coercive to often rogue countries like DPRK, North Korea and Iran and Russia, and to some extent China, whether there's a reform of the global banking system that is in everybody's mutual interests. Put that with shadow banking alongside crypto, there are obviously big strategic questions to ask. Probably everyone in this room would agree that the more multilateral those conversations can be, the better. But there's no question that the US also has seen that the attempts to forge something that is not based on the US dollar and to have a non-SWIFT banking system looks like it's an attempt to destabilize the US. And it's not surprising that the United States will try to use its position to at least stop the horse from bolting. And I think that's probably, there's a wider conversation to have again, I think there's likely a solution. For India, look, the transformation of India over the last 10 years has been extraordinary in terms of the data consumption, the road building, twice or 3 times now the number of international airports. It's been a great success story, but we have 35% unemployment for people under the age of 30. So the question is for that Gen Z, I mentioned the protest, is does the future look good for the people who we're investing in the future? And I'm very concerned globally that conversation looks like it's not being properly had, that we're getting older and richer, and young people are having more and more expectations with less and less rewards. And that's something which you see in history again and again. The loss of confidence in democratic systems, the loss of confidence in leaderships, and the willingness to take action, I think is something that's not a question just for India, but for large parts of the world, I think I'm concerned about. In India, I think the water issues, the climate stuff looks quite acute, particularly in the south. We had temperature levels above 50 degrees centigrade in both India and Pakistan. The damage that does to soil chemistry, to agricultural production, and to human health is a real challenge. And so I'm broadly optimistic about India, its direction of travel, some of the big strategic things that it's done. But there's, I think, quite a few pieces that need to be put right. I mean, so I've been following air quality slightly too obsessively. But in Diwali in Delhi on Monday, Tuesday, air quality was 56 times higher than World Health Organization levels deemed safe. Delhi has, on average, 8 years off everybody's life expectancy. If we can add a single year to people's life expectancy globally, that's worth about $4 trillion, according to most medical research. Adding 10 years, it's the multi-trillion dollars of productivities. So it's fixing some of the challenges around environmental protections that have been forced onto the developing world, the global south, India, China, but it's about how those get paid for, cleaned up, and so on. And I don't think anybody in the Indian government has any illusions about it, but when you have populations of 1.4 billion, like India and China do, it's harder to do that than in Singapore. That's just a challenge. Global trade and regulation, I don't think there's anything similar to the World Trade Organization in the past. I suppose the closest thing you have to it are measuring the rate of exchange between currencies. And by and large, the stability of silver plays the key role in keeping prices within the kind of inflationary brackets that facilitate common trade. So you find stable economic exchange without leaders discussing how to do things. Once you reach internal borders, then it's a separate story, and it's a similar sort of thing that you'd expect everywhere, which is corruption by border guards is endemic, so how do you stop that from happening? How do you have good accounting to see what's coming into your state or your kingdom? And we find reeds and sticks written down by customs officials in China 2,500 years ago, a bit like when I arrive at Changi Airport, writing down who I am, where I come from, where I say I come from. Is there a check that that's actually true? What have I got in my luggage? How long am I going to be here? Where am I going to stay? And when do I leave? And some of that is about surveillance and control, but some of it is about being able to account for what's going on so you can have optimum tax takes. But it's quite clear that the more people are moving, the greater levels of exchange, therefore, by and large, the greater levels of the ability to generate tax. So I don't think it works quite within a WTO framework. It stands to reason that the more points you have to pass through, the more taxes get added. So when news gets back to Venice, which has been the preeminent European banking center and trade center, the route of all goods from the Middle East and the Near East and Central Asia and China to reach Europe, when news reaches Venice that a Portuguese ship has made it round the tip of Africa to India, a senator goes to the roof of his palace and has today what we call a mental health crisis. But he sits on the top of his palace roof for 4 days crying, saying Venice is finished because the tax on the goods that are loaded once and then not until they reach Portugal means that Venice's financial system is broken. And broadly speaking, he was right. It took about 150 years for that to take place. But currencies and stable exchange rates is what drives some of that. Ponder the improbable. Well, what do I say? A lot of my day job is about thinking about bad news. And those improbable events are ones that produce friction and breakdown. I was unlucky enough to be asked to come and ponder the improbable in number 10 Downing Street in December 2019. And I said that the two things I was worried about was a global pandemic and then the lack of a global monitoring system and responses to the pandemic. So I've got lots in my concern list of pondering the improbable. I guess that probably to leave everybody in an upbeat and happy mood, which is in everybody's interest, particularly if you want to get invited back, is to remind the thing I said at the beginning, which is that this might look like a world that's in catastrophic, that we're on the edge, and perhaps in a week's time, if an Austrian Archduke or the equivalent, whatever it would be today, gets shot on the streets of Sarajevo or wherever the equivalent of that would be today, maybe we will topple over into global cataclysmic war. I'd like to think that by and large, we do quite good things. I mean, I know the new Taylor Swift album's not supposed to be any good, but we create amazing food in Singapore that I've had more than I can handle in the last 2 weeks. You know, amazing ways in which we have these technologies that can make us solve disease and reverse carbon emissions and do carbon capture to make our world cleaner and better. We're pretty good on humanitarian stuff, although we should be better. There are, I think, lots of things that we should be focusing on. And I think it is important for historians, commentators, RSIS, to be pumping out some of these good things and metrics, rather than warning about what life on Earth and how precarious it might be, because those are all there in the sort of the Richter needle is wobbling quite hard, but I promise you it could all be a lot worse.
Well, on that positive note, I think it's a good time to wrap up. We can have the not so happy side over a beer afterwards, I think. But please join me in thanking Professor Frankopan for a very interesting session.